Imagine you're a Texas Ranger in 1844 and you bump your revolutionary 5-shot Colt Patterson against your saddle. It fires into your leg instantly, not because you pulled the trigger, but because the hammer was resting on a live percussion cap. Your cutting-edge weapon just shot you. Advanced meant safer, right? Wrong. More shots meant more protection? Fatal mistake. New technology saved lives? It ended them. Today, we reveal the top 10 most dangerous Wild West weapons that terrorize their own users. Before we dive into the weapons that exploded or fired sideways, let's talk about one that seemed perfectly normal until you realized it was pointing at you the whole time. The Colt Patterson, the Accidental Discharge Special. Picture this. You're a Texas Ranger in 1840, and you've just gotten your hands on the world's first practical revolver. 5 shots without reloading. It's revolutionary. The Texas Rangers used these weapons to devastating effect against Comanche warriors, with Captain Jack Hayes and his men routing forces of 80 warriors with just 14 Rangers. But here's the problem nobody talks about. There's no safety mechanism whatsoever. The Colt Patterson was Samuel Colt's first big success, patented in 1836 and produced in Paterson, New Jersey. At $40 to $50 each, that's over $1,000 in today's money, it was an expensive piece of cutting-edge technology. But this thing had a fatal flaw that killed more than a few cowboys. See, when you loaded all 5 chambers, the hammer rested directly on a percussion cap. One bump, one hard ride, even just holstering it wrong, and bang, you're shooting yourself in the leg. The Rangers quickly learned to load only 4 chambers and rest the hammer on the empty one, but not before plenty of accidents happened. Some carried it with the hammer at half cock, but that was even more dangerous. The U.S. government actually called it excessively fragile and prone to malfunction, which is military speak for "this thing is dangerous as hell." The weapon had to be partially disassembled just to reload until 1839, when they finally added a loading lever. But even then, the safety problem remained. The Rangers who survived learning to use these weapons became legends. Those who didn't became cautionary tales about why you never rest a hammer on a live percussion cap. But accidental discharges were nothing compared to what happened when this next weapon decided to fire all its barrels at once. The Pepperbox pistol, the chain fire nightmare. Now this is where things get really scary. The Pepperbox pistol was basically 6 or more barrels arranged in a circle, each loaded with its own bullet. Pull the trigger and the whole assembly rotates to fire the next barrel. Popular during the California Gold Rush, these weapons promised rapid-fire capability when single-shot pistols dominated the market. Sounds cool, right? Well, Mark Twain had something to say about that. In his book, Roughing It, Twain wrote about a friend's Allen Pepperbox. It was a cheerful weapon, the Allen. Sometimes all its 6 barrels would go off at once, and then there was no safe place in all the region round about, but behind it. He wasn't kidding. These things were notorious for chain fires, where all barrels would discharge simultaneously in a terrifying burst of uncontrolled firepower. The problem was in the design. The percussion caps sat exposed and close together, so when you fired one barrel, the flash could ignite the others. Imagine pulling the trigger expecting one shot and getting a machine gun burst instead, in random directions. The barrels weren't rifled, so accuracy was terrible even when they worked correctly. Ethan Allen of Massachusetts was the primary manufacturer, producing over 10,000 between 1846 and 1848. Despite their popularity, these weapons were so unreliable that a California judge in 1851 ruled that an Allen Pepperbox could not be construed as falling within the category of a dangerous weapon, because it was so inaccurate. Think about that. It was too unpredictable to even be considered dangerous to your enemies. Gold miners called them more dangerous to the shooter than to the shot at, but they were cheap and available when better weapons weren't. Speaking of unpredictable, let's talk about what happened when Colt tried to make a rifle version. The Colt Revolving Rifle. The hand shredder. Sam Colt thought, hey, if revolvers work great as pistols, why not make a rifle? big mistake. The Colt revolving rifle took everything dangerous about revolvers and made it worse by putting your support hand right in the danger zone. These weapons saw limited use in the Civil War and were carried by Pony Express guards on the dangerous run between Independence, Missouri, and Santa Fe. Civil War soldiers actually used these things, and they absolutely hated them. Here's why. There's a gap between the cylinder and the barrel where hot gas, lead fragments, and burning powder shoot out sideways. With a pistol, your hands are behind this gap. With a rifle, your left hand is right there in the line of fire, getting blasted with molten metal and lead splinters every time you pulled the trigger. Chain fires were even worse. When multiple chambers went off at once, soldiers got sprayed with a fountain of superheated debris. Military reports said soldiers disliked them exceedingly due to the flash and loud report so close to the face and the fact that they kept getting injured by their own weapons. The weapon literally attacked its user with every shot. Some commanders actually ordered their men to hold these rifles only by the trigger guard or the loading lever to keep their hands out of the shrapnel zone. When your own army has to develop special techniques to avoid getting maimed by your weapon, that's a serious design flaw. The rifles were mechanically sound and could deliver devastating firepower, but the cost was measured in friendly casualties. Many were simply abandoned after soldiers realized that fighting the enemy shouldn't require first surviving your own equipment. But what about weapons that seemed perfectly safe until the moment they weren't? The Martini Henry, the cartridge jail. The British Empire thought they had the perfect rifle. The Martini Henry was accurate, powerful, and could drop a charging enemy at 200 yards with its massive 577 by 450 cartridge. Adopted in 1871, it was designed to give British forces a decisive advantage in colonial conflicts. The single-shot, lever-action design was simple and reliable, or so they thought. There was just one little problem. Sometimes it would trap its own ammunition. This rifle used thin brass cartridges made from coiled brass sheets that would expand dramatically when fired. In the heat of battle, these cases would stick in the chamber or tear apart during extraction, turning your rifle into an expensive club. The brass was so thin and weak that it would literally weld itself to the chamber walls from the heat and pressure of firing. At the Battle of Isandlwana during the Zulu War in 1879, British soldiers died not from Zulu spears, but from rifles that jammed solid when they needed them most. Picture this. You're facing a Zulu charge, you fire once, and your rifle turns into a club because the brass case is stuck in the chamber. Panic sets in as you struggle with the lever, but the cartridge won't budge. The British had to add longer extraction levers just to give soldiers more leverage to pry out stuck cartridges. They even carried cleaning rods into battle, not for accuracy, but for survival. The problem was so severe that they eventually switched to solid-drawn brass cases instead of the weak-coiled ones. The weapon that was supposed to secure the British Empire nearly lost it because of a simple ammunition problem that turned deadly when reliability mattered most. Let's talk about a weapon that was dangerous in a completely different way. The Volcanic Repeater, the underpowered bomb. The Volcanic Repeater promised to be the future of firearms. Developed in the 1850s by the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company, which included a young shirt manufacturer named Oliver Winchester as an investor, it used revolutionary rocket ball ammunition where the powder was built right into the bullet. 10 shots in a tubular magazine, lever action operation, no separate powder and ball to mess with. It should have been perfect. But here's the thing. The bullets were so weak they could barely penetrate a heavy coat. The self-contained powder charge was so small that the weapon had almost no stopping power. Mark Twain wrote about shooting prairie dogs with these things and watching them shake off the bullets like raindrops. The ammunition was so underpowered that sometimes it wouldn't even cycle the action properly, leaving you with a jammed rifle. The real danger came from the ammunition design itself. Having all that powder contained in bullets sitting in a tube magazine was basically building a pipe bomb. If the powder in one cartridge ignited from impact, friction, or even just the heat of repeated firing, it could set off the whole magazine in a chain reaction. The weapon would literally explode in your hands. The Volcanic Repeater failed so spectacularly that it killed its own company. The design was abandoned, and the company reorganized under new leadership. But from its ashes rose the Henry rifle, which used rimfire ammunition, and eventually the Winchester. Sometimes the greatest successes come from the most dangerous failures. The Volcanic taught designers that innovation without practical testing could be literally explosive. Its failure paved the way for the lever-action rifles that would truly tame the frontier. Now let's talk about ammunition that was dangerous just to load. The Pinfire cartridge weapons, the walking bombshells. French inventors in the 1850s thought they were being clever when they created Pinfire cartridges. Instead of percussion caps, these cartridges had little metal pins sticking out the side that you'd hit with a hammer. The system spread to America through imports and licensed production, becoming popular with cavalry officers and wealthy sportsmen who saw them as symbols of technological sophistication. Clean, efficient, modern. What could go wrong? Everything. Those pins stuck out of the cartridge case about a quarter inch, which meant they could be hit by accident from any angle. Drop a loaded weapon? The pin hits the ground and fires. Bump it against your saddle? Same thing. Even loading these cartridges was like playing Russian roulette because the pins were exposed and ready to fire at the slightest touch. The system was mechanically brilliant. The pin would be driven into the powder charge, creating reliable ignition. But the practical reality was terrifying. Cavalry officers would load these weapons and then pray they didn't have to ride hard, because the bouncing motion could set off the pins. Loading required extreme care, as you had to align each pin perfectly without striking it. The danger wasn't just theoretical. Accidents were common enough that many owners lived in constant fear of their own weapons. The system was so dangerous that most Pinfire weapons were eventually converted to safer centerfire systems by gunsmiths who made good money fixing the French mistake. The innovation was brilliant, but the execution was lethal. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is one that fires exactly when you don't want it to, and Pinfire cartridges fired whenever physics demanded it. But if exposed firing pins were scary, wait until you hear about this design. The Harmonica Gun, the sideways shooter. Jonathan Browning, the father of the legendary John Moses Browning, created what he called the Harmonica Gun in the 1850s. Mormon pioneers needed firepower for hostile territory, and Browning thought he had the answer. It used a horizontal sliding magazine that looked like a harmonica, hence the name. Slide the magazine sideways, and the next chamber aligns with the barrel. Simple, mechanical, and theoretically effective. The concept was actually ingenious. Instead of complex rotating mechanisms, you just slid a loaded magazine across the action. Each chamber was preloaded and ready to fire. No cylinder timing, no complex indexing, just linear progression from chamber to chamber. It seemed like the perfect solution for frontier conditions where mechanical complexity was a liability. Sounds simple enough, except when it wasn't. The timing had to be absolutely perfect, or bullets would fire sideways through the mechanism instead of forward. The sliding magazine had to align precisely with the barrel, and frontier conditions were brutal on mechanical precision. Dirt, moisture, and rough handling would throw off the alignment, turning each shot into a gamble. Mechanical failures sent rounds in completely random directions, missed the alignment by even a fraction of an inch, and you're shooting everywhere except where you're aiming. The sliding action was also slow and awkward, requiring two hands to operate effectively. In a gunfight, that hesitation could be fatal. Browning eventually abandoned the design after realizing that some mechanical solutions create more problems than they solve. The Harmonica Gun taught him valuable lessons about the importance of mechanical reliability that would inform his later masterpieces. Sometimes the path to perfection requires walking through the valley of spectacular failure. Speaking of problems, let's talk about a weapon that pointed loaded barrels at the shooter. The turret revolver, the self-aiming device. Some genius inventor in the 1850s looked at regular revolvers and thought, what if we made the cylinder horizontal instead of vertical? The result was the turret revolver, and it was every bit as dangerous as it sounds. Multiple inventors tried variations of this concept, believing that horizontal rotation might provide better mechanical advantage and faster reloading than traditional vertical cylinder designs. The horizontal cylinder meant that in any position, at least 2 loaded chambers were pointing directly at the shooter's body. Think about that geometry for a second. While one chamber pointed at your target, 2 others pointed at you. A chain fire didn't just multiply your firepower, it aimed that firepower directly at you. The weapon literally became a mechanical suicide device that occasionally fired at enemies. The mechanical theory seemed sound. Horizontal rotation should have been smoother and more reliable than vertical systems. The cylinder could be shorter and stronger, and reloading might be easier with gravity helping instead of fighting the mechanism. But the fatal flaw was obvious to anyone who held one. You were always staring down the barrels of your own weapon. Even Civil War-era shooters, who weren't exactly known for their safety consciousness, understood that having loaded guns pointed at yourself was catastrophically bad design. The few manufacturers who tried to produce these weapons quickly discovered that people didn't want to buy firearms that were more dangerous to them than to their enemies. Production stopped almost immediately because, surprisingly, market research showed that customers preferred weapons that didn't aim at them. The turret revolver died quickly, becoming a footnote in firearms history and a reminder that sometimes the most obvious problem is the most fatal one. Now for something that was dangerous in a completely different way, the improper powder load. The hand grenade. This wasn't a specific weapon, but a mistake that turned any muzzle loader into a potential bomb. Some shooters would accidentally use smokeless powder in weapons designed for black powder, not understanding that smokeless powder is about 3 times more powerful. It was like putting rocket fuel in a campfire. The results were explosive and usually fatal. The problem was knowledge and availability. As smokeless powder became available in the late 1800s, some shooters assumed all powder was the same. They'd take their grandfather's musket and load it with modern smokeless powder, not realizing they were creating a pipe bomb. The weapon couldn't handle the pressure, and the result was catastrophic failure. The entire weapon would explode like a hand grenade, sending metal fragments flying in all directions. One documented case from the 1800s had a man's rifle explode and rip off his fingers when he used the wrong powder. The weapon didn't just fail, it literally blew apart in his hands, taking parts of him with it. This wasn't a design flaw, but a user error that killed people. The physics were simple but deadly. Too much pressure in a container designed for lower pressure equals explosion. The fragments from exploding rifles could kill bystanders as well as the shooter, making this mistake dangerous for everyone nearby. The scary part? This mistake still happens today when modern shooters don't understand the difference between black powder and smokeless powder. Some dangers are timeless, and the physics of exploding rifles haven't changed much in 150 years. Modern black powder weapons still come with warnings about using only black powder, but every year someone learns this lesson the hard way. And finally, let's talk about the most insidious danger of all: the defective trigger mechanism, the hair trigger killer. Throughout the Wild West era, some weapons had trigger mechanisms so sensitive they could fire from the slightest touch, temperature change, or even vibration. These weren't design features. They were defects that killed people. The quest for quick, light triggers sometimes resulted in mechanisms that were dangerously unstable. Hunters would die when rifles discharged while being loaded. Cowboys would shoot themselves while holstering weapons. Shopkeepers would be killed by firearms that went off when moved or cleaned. The trigger that was supposed to give you control over your weapon instead turned it into a random death machine that fired without warning. The problem was mechanical sensitivity gone wrong. Gunsmiths would file down springs, adjust sears, and lighten trigger pulls to make weapons faster and more responsive. But there's a fine line between a crisp trigger and a dangerous one, and frontier gunsmiths often crossed it. The result was weapons that would fire from being jarred, bumped, or even just handled roughly. Temperature changes were especially dangerous. Metal expands and contracts with temperature, and a trigger mechanism that worked fine in cool weather might become hair trigger sensitive in the heat. Cowboys learned to be extra careful with their weapons in hot weather, but accidents still happened regularly. The most famous modern example is the Remington 700 series, which had trigger problems that led to thousands of accidental deaths and massive lawsuits. But this problem existed in primitive forms throughout the frontier era. Defective triggers remind us that even the most basic safety mechanisms can fail catastrophically, turning trusted tools into unpredictable killers. The Wild West wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly by design. These weapons didn't just misfire, they betrayed their own users. If this shocked you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more hidden history that hits hard. More jaw-dropping stories are on the way.